Professor Fred Delmeyer, Professor Hans Koschler, Professor Richard Falk. Friends, peace be with you. I'd like to begin by extending Just's warmest greetings to the World Peace Forum. As Fred said, we are, in a sense, related to one another. It's an organization which shares so many of our ideals and our goals, which is why we've always been happy to work with the forum. Friends, in fact, the other three persons who are sitting here are also connected with JUST. They're all members of JUST's International Advisory Panel, and I think that was a coincidence, the way everyone got into the same panel. I would like to look at this very important challenge that confronts us, the decline of US global hegemony and the possibilities that lie ahead. There is no doubt at all, friends, that US Helmed drive for global hegemony has been the most significant trend in international politics in the last 6 decades or so. But the US has failed to achieve its objective. Why? I shall advance 3 reasons, which I'll elaborate in a while. Number one, like all empires in the past, the United States' indulgence in wars, in military adventures, and the consequences emanating from these wars is one of the primary reasons for its decline. Number two, the resistance of the victims and others who have also been resisting the US attempt to establish global hegemony. A second reason. The third reason is the rise of new centers of power in the course of the last 2 decades. Let me try to elaborate on each of these points very briefly. The first, the wars. Afghanistan, Iraq, and of course, the US involvement in Libya, its direct and indirect involvement in Syria, Somalia, Sudan, and of course, Palestine, as far as that region of the world is concerned. You'll see that there is a certain pattern. Invariably, there is a justification that is provided which very often sounds noble. In the case of Afghanistan, it was to fight terror, but the underlying motives related to geostrategic and geoeconomic interests. In the case of Iraq, to get rid of weapons of mass destruction, which turned out to be a monstrous lie. The underlying motives related to oil, to Israel, and to larger US interests in the region. If you look at Libya, here again, dictator massacring his own people, but again, the motives related to oil, to China, to Gaddafi and his vision for Africa. These were some of the driving forces. And again, in the case of Syria, brutal dictatorship, killing his own citizens, but we know that there are other reasons, of course, related to resistance in West Asia, to the link between Syria and Iran and Hezbollah, and of course, the whole question of Israel and Israel's desire to ensure that its neighborhood is totally secure, which has become more of a challenge to Israel in the midst of the Arab uprising and in the face of US decline. And of course, in the case of Israel itself, the reason given invariably is that one has to try to establish peace and so on, when you know that the real motive is to enhance Israel's position in the region. And in each and every instance, and especially in the case of Afghanistan and Iraq, and also in the case of Israeli occupation of Palestine, thousands and thousands of lives have been lost over a period of time. This is the price that people have had to pay. Tremendous sacrifice in order to maintain hegemonic power. I said a while ago, friends, that resistance is the other reason why the hegemon has not been able to establish total dominance. Resistance from victims. I'd mentioned all of them a while ago. Israel, in the case of Israel, it's the Palestinian people, Iraqi people, the Afghans, the people of Sudan, of Somalia, Libya, Syria. They've been resisting in their own way. So resistance has been a very important factor. It's not just resistance in West Asia and North Africa. There is also resistance to hegemonic designs expressed in a different way. There is Russian resistance, for instance, Georgia, Ukraine, also what is perceived as some of the larger plans in that part of the world. There is resistance from China, and it's becoming more and more pronounced now, with the US declaring itself as the pivot of the Pacific, and China asserting its own presence in the face of the US's power over the South China Sea, East China Sea, and so on. There is also resistance in another part of the world, which I think is very, very important, but not often highlighted, the resistance from Latin America to US hegemony. Resistance from within its own neighborhood. At the beginning, it was just Cuba. But now you find there is Venezuela, there's Bolivia, there's Nicaragua, there's Ecuador. There are countries like Chile and Argentina in different ways who are resisting the Washington consensus. And that, I think, is also very significant. Now, the resistance from these different forces in different parts of the world has expressed itself through different channels. Some of these channels we may not condone. There has been violence, in some instances, senseless violence associated with resistance. But we should not, while condemning that violence, and we should condemn that violence whenever it happens, we should not lose sight of the larger picture. That what is happening is very significant, that there is resistance. Resistance is linked to the rise of new centers of power. The countries which are resisting hegemony, whether it is Latin America or countries in West Asia like Iran or Russia or China, they represent certain new forces at work. You take Latin America, for instance. Look at the cooperation amongst 8 Latin American countries under ALBA. ALBA is a new form of regional cooperation, expanded to CELAC. That, I think, is very significant. It's part of the change that we're witnessing. Resistance through regional entities. If you look at West Asia, Iran and its resistance, Iran has also become a very important scientific power in the course of the last 10 or 15 years. It is rated as one of the top producers of articles in scientific journals in the last 4 or 5 years. So there is a change that is taking place. Likewise, if you look at resistance from Russia, it is very, very significant because there are new ideas which are emerging. The concept of Eurasia, for instance, which I think has got strategic and geopolitical significance for the future. And most of all, the rise of China. The rise of China is perhaps the most important single development as far as these changes go. China has become the factory of the world, the anchor of the global economy, trade, investments. In almost every part of the world, in Latin America, Africa, every country in Asia, China is a major force. And given that there are new regional entities that have emerged, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, you have BRICS, China has played a very big role in it. And at the same time, you find that there is cooperation across continents, which again is not highlighted. It is significant, for instance, that ELBA, for instance, works closely with both Syria and Iran. They are observer members of ELBA. And there's been a great deal of exchange between countries in these two continents. There is also, I think, a segment of civil society which has become more active since the war in Iraq in 2003. It has lost a bit of its momentum, it's true, but nonetheless, it is yet another development that has some significance. In view of all this, I've argued in my paper, friends, that we are moving towards a multipolar, multicentric world. It is inevitable, it's irreversible. Partly because of the decline of the centers of power in the West, but also because of all these changes that are taking place. This is happening. It is a positive development. I would like to describe it as a post-hegemonic world, meaning by which we have seen the last hegemon in human history. And I'm saying this for a variety of reasons, because I know there's a great deal of concern about China. People say, does the rise of China represent a new hegemon? But I'm arguing here that we are actually moving into a post-hegemonic world. I do not see China playing the role of the United States of America. The sort of power that the US had in 1945 was in some ways unique. A combination of every dimension of power in one nation state. Military, politics, economics, culture, information, technology. I think that's a moment that has passed forever. China may have economic power, but it doesn't have Russia's military power. Russia does not have China's economic power. You have other centers that are emerging. South Korea, for instance, part of the changes that are taking place is scientifically very strong. It's stronger in some respects than China. So you have a situation where power is diffused and dispersed. That is one of the factors we have to keep in mind. We also have to remember some very basic facts about China. If you look at China and the various border disputes it has been involved in since 1949, since the establishment of the Communist Republic, its border disputes have been related largely to securing its own boundaries. It is not related to conquest. Whether it was McMahon Line with India in 1962 or its problems with Vietnam in 1974 and 1988, they're all related to its borders, its boundaries, which has been China's obsession right through history, securing its borders. It is significant, friends, again, little known fact, that the borders, the territorial land borders of China today, its size is not different from what it was 200 years before the Common Era. In other words, there's been no expansion as far as China is concerned.